at it or undermine it. As for politicians crying in public, well, I think that if a man cries in public, everybody thinks he's very in touch with his feelings and rather wonderful. If a woman cried in public, I'm afraid they'd think she was absolutely hopeless. So we're not quite there yet. Equality in crying.
Have you ever been tempted? Have you ever felt moved, held back the tears? I don't know.
I think that, you know, the reality is that there is still a minority of women in politics, and people are still looking to see whether or not they can level the accusation that you can't actually hack it, and therefore if you broke down and cried, well, I don't know, perhaps somebody should try it, but I'm going to err on the side of caution.
Will Self, does this spectacle, Will Self, make you warm inside or cringe?
Amazing to think that Ken Livingstone actually can cry. I mean, so steely is his ambition that one might worry that his eyelids would rust.
Poor chap, he's not here to defend himself.
That may be so, but I mean, it's no surprise to me that there was a certain amount of massaging in order to get these people to say these things on. Well, you know, those of us who...
Don't believe what you read on the blogs.
Well, those of us who remember the election, Tony Blair's first election triumph, in which Labour supporters were bussed in to play the part of cheering happy crowds in number 10, fondly see the same phenomenon at work.
What about the principle, though?
Well, the principle of crying in public? I think people should cry in public, they should scream in public, they should dance up and down naked, they should roll on the ground frothing at the mouth. I've had enough with formality. I'm going to begin it myself shortly.
Maybe it's just as well this is radio. Ken Clarke, I have to say, I find it hard to imagine you crying in public, or indeed doing any of those other things we've just...
No, not yet, I haven't managed to. I'm sorry I missed this great BAFTA performance, actually. Party political broadcasts are usually absolutely dire, but this one obviously was quite something. My answer to your question is it rather depends what he or she is crying about. I mean, whether you feel any sympathy with them, but to actually manage to burst into tears in the middle of a total charade when the people you've hired have presumably played their part so movingly, or you're a bit worried about the fees you're going to have to pay them. I don't know which are going to be. That you get moved to tears is not... I just wish the mayoral election in London could be raised to a slightly higher plane. One thing I do agree with Harriet on is I think that the residents of London would quite like to hear things rather more seriously addressed than the actual transport and other issues, and you know, whether they're going to keep the council tax controlled as Boris has managed to do, whilst I think doing a lot for London's transport, all those kind of things, instead of putting on pantomime performances of the kind which, from the newspapers, it sounds as though this one was.
Before we hear from Bronwyn, I'm just going to give Harriet Harman a chance to stick up for Ken Livingstone.
Well, I think that, you know, this is a fiction and an attempt to undermine the arguments that Ken's putting forward on his programme. He's got a very important programme about the police, about fares, about educational opportunities, and that was Londoners speaking for themselves. And I think, you know, that we should get on to the substantive agenda of the difference that the mayor will make. So I know that, you know, Will can make jokes about it, Ken can pursue the fiction, but actually those were people saying why they feel that they can think things could be better in London.
Were they real people?
No, actually,
were they real people?
Some of us who live in London and faced with this mayoral race are so fed up that Labour can't field a better candidate than Livingstone that it makes us weak.
Just one point is
stop that argument there because it's getting of a very particular kind and down a completely different route.
Will has attempted to
I'd
give
like
us...
Bronwyn Maddox to respond to the question, which, just to remind you, since it may have been forgotten all this, what do the panel feel about politicians crying in public or showing emotion? Showing emotion as well as crying.
Well, on this one point, I will defend Ken Livingstone, because that image of him, not just crying, but fists in eyes, hunched over, Ed Miliband trying to comfort him, has given so much pleasure to so many people. How could we possibly be against it? But on the principle, of course, it depends entirely what they're crying about, and yet real human suffering and loss right in front of them, or personal tragedy, yes. Everything else, no.
Don't you think, Ken Clark, just being slightly more serious for a moment, that there is a case, perhaps, for saying that politicians of your generation perhaps are a bit stuffy sometimes and could let themselves show slightly more feeling, given that you are dealing with very important issues that affect people's lives in a very direct way?
Well, I don't think. I think politicians are the usual range of human nature, so I don't think they've significantly changed in terms of how emotional they are. Otherwise, actually, if I may say so, I think in this mass media age, politicians have become slightly more artificial in public nowadays than they used to be when I started, personally, in defence of the last surviving veterans of a time when politics was not quite so dominated by theatricals as this party political appears to be.
Yes.
Very good. Let's just hear what our questioner made of all that.
Well, personally, I'm a fan of Ken Livingstone's, and I think, he did a lot for London, and I think he obviously feels very strongly. So I think there's nothing wrong with showing a bit of emotion, frankly.
All right. Thank you very much.